Saint Peter the Apostle, original name Simeon or Simon, died 64 CE, Rome, Italy, disciple of Jesus Christ, recognized in the early Christian Church as the leader of the 12 disciples and by the Roman Catholic Church as the first of its unbroken succession of popes. Peter, a Jewish fisherman, was called to be a disciple of Jesus at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He received from Jesus the name Cephas, from Aramaic Kepa, rock, hence Peter, from Petros, a Greek translation of Kepa. The man and his position among the disciples. The sources of information concerning the life of Peter are limited to the New Testament, the 4 Gospels, Acts, the letters of Paul, and the 2 letters that bear the name of Peter. He probably was known originally by the Hebrew name Simeon or the Greek form of that name, Simon. The former appears only twice in the New Testament, the latter 49 times. At solemn moments, Gospel according to John chapter 21 verse 15, he was called Simon, son of John. The Gospel according to John prefers Simon 17 times, or the compound, rarely found elsewhere, of Simon Peter. Though Paul has a distinct preference, 8 times out of 10, for the Greek transliteration Cephas, Latinized as Cephas, of the Aramaic name or title Kepa, meaning rock, the Gospels and Acts use the Greek translation Petros approximately 150 times. From the Synoptic Gospels, Gospel according to Matthew chapter 8 verse 14, and Paul, first letter of Paul to the Corinthians 9-5, there is indirect evidence that Peter was the son of John and was married. His family originally came from Bethsaida in Galilee, John chapter 1 verse 44, but during the period of Jesus' ministry Peter lived in Capernaum, at the northwest end of the Sea of Galilee, where he and his brother Saint Andrew were in partnership as fishermen with Saint James and Saint John, the sons of Zebedee. Gospel according to Luke chapter 5 verse 10. Much can be learned about Peter from the New Testament, either explicitly from the statements made by and about Peter or indirectly from his actions and reactions as revealed in a number of episodes in which he figures prominently. He was at times vacillating and unsure, as in his relations with the Church of Antioch when he at first ate with the Gentiles and later refused to do so. Letter of Paul to the Galatians chapter 2 verses 11-14. He could also be resolute, Acts of the Apostles 4:10, 5-110. Occasionally he is depicted as rash and hasty, Luke chapter 22 verse 33, etc., or irritable and capable of great anger, John chapter 18 verse 10. Often he is pictured as gentle but firm and, as in his professions of love to Jesus, capable of great loyalty and love, John chapter 21 verses 15-17. The New Testament reports that Peter was unlearned in the sense that he was untrained in the Mosaic law, Acts chapter 4 verse 13, and it is doubtful that he knew Greek. He apparently learned slowly and erred time and time again, but later, when entrusted with responsibility, he demonstrated that he was mature and capable. The Gospels agree that Peter was called to be a disciple of Jesus at the beginning of his ministry, but when and where the event took place is recorded differently in the several Gospels. Luke 5, 1-11, scarcely mentions James and John and omits Andrew while emphasizing the call of Peter. Matthew 4, 18-22, and Mark, Gospel according to Mark chapter 1 verses 16-20, note the call of the 4 men and, with Luke, agree that the event took place at the Sea of Galilee. The Gospel according to John places the call in Judea, 1:28, and states that Andrew, who had been a follower of Saint John the Baptist, 1:35, and had heard John indicate that Jesus was the Lamb of God, left John and introduced Peter to the Messiah, who at that time gave him the name, or title, Cephas, i.e., Peter, or rock. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are probably correct in recording that the call to Peter was extended in Galilee when Jesus first began his work in that area. The Gospel according to John is here, as elsewhere, perhaps more theological than historically motivated. The author of John wishes to stress that Peter recognized Jesus' messiahship from the beginning and that Jesus had seen Simon as the rock from their first meeting. The Synoptic Gospels largely agree in the amount of emphasis each gives to the leadership of Peter among the 12 apostles, but there are differences also. For example, in one case Matthew and Luke note that Peter was the speaker in questioning Jesus about a parable, but Mark attributes these words to the group of disciples, Matthew chapter 15 verse 15, Luke chapter 8 verse 45, and Mark chapter 7 verse 17. With differing degrees of emphasis, the Synoptic Gospels agree that Peter served as spokesman, the outstanding member of the group, and enjoyed a certain precedence over the other disciples. Whenever the disciples are listed, Peter is invariably mentioned first. Matthew chapter 10 verses 2 to 4, Mark chapter 3 verses 16 to 19, Luke chapter 6 verses 14 to 16, Acts chapter 1 verse 13. Compare only Galatians chapter 2 verse 9. Although it is not certain whether or not this priority is primarily due to reading back into the gospel narrative Peter's importance in the apostolic church, his forceful personality was surely a factor. Those not belonging to the immediate followers of Jesus also recognized the authority of Peter, such as when the collectors of the temple tax approached him for information. Matthew chapter 17 verse 24. Again, with characteristic quickness he sought a clarification from Jesus on behalf of the disciples concerning the meaning of a parable, Matthew chapter 15 verse 15, or of a saying, Matthew chapter 18 verse 21. As both an individual and a representative of the 12 apostles, he made a plea for personal preference in the kingdom of heaven as a reward for faithful service, Matthew chapter 19 verses 27, 28. On several occasions, Peter alone is mentioned by name and others are indicated as merely accompanying him, Mark chapter 1 verse 36, Luke chapter 8 verse 45. Even when the three disciples closest to Jesus, the pillars, Peter, James, and John, figure in a particular incident, it is frequently Peter alone who is named. When the three are named, Peter's name invariably appears first, as in Matthew chapter 17 verses 1, 26, 37. It was his home in Capernaum that Jesus visited when he cured Peter's mother-in-law, Matthew chapter 8 verse 14, and it was Peter's boat that Jesus used when he instructed the crowd, Luke chapter 5 verse 3. It was Peter who possessed remarkable insight and displayed his depth of faith in the confession of Christ as the Son of God, Matthew chapter 16 verses 15 to 18, Mark chapter 8 verse 29, Luke chapter 9 verse 20, and it was Peter who rebuked, and in turn was rebuked by, Jesus when the Master prophesied that he would suffer and die, Mark chapter 8 verse 32, 33. It was also Peter who manifested the momentary weakness of even the strongest when he denied his Lord, Matthew chapter 26 verses 69 to 75, Mark chapter 14 verses 66 to 72, Luke chapter 22 verses 54 to 61. Later, however, with greater maturity, Peter discovered strength and, as he was charged by Jesus, Luke chapter 22 verses 31, 32, effected the strengthening of others. Finally, Peter, who survived his denial, is permitted to be the first of the apostles to see Jesus after the resurrection, Luke chapter 24 verse 34. In John's Gospel the prominence of Peter is challenged in the person of St. John the Apostle, the beloved disciple. Though Peter receives mention in John chapter 37 times, out of a total of 109 times in the four Gospels, 1/3 of the references are found in the appendix, chapter 21, and he appears in only 9 incidents. The Gospel according to John attempts to show the close relationship between John and Jesus while still reserving to Peter the role of representative and spokesman. The fact that Peter is emphasized in John and charged by Jesus to tend my sheep and feed my lambs, John chapter 21 verses 15, 16, at the same time that the role of the disciples as a whole is being de-emphasized attests to the prestige of Peter in the apostolic church. But throughout John's Gospel, Peter shares his prominence with John, 13:24, 18:15, 19:26, 27, etc. Among the purposes of chapter 21 in emphasizing Peter may well be an attempt to restore the disciple who denied his Lord to the position he enjoyed in the Synoptic Gospels. Saint Peter the Apostle. Incidents important in interpretations of Peter. Out of the many incidents in which Peter figures prominently in the Gospels, 3 should be separately considered, for each is important, contains problems of interpretation, and is controversial. In Mark 8:29 and Luke 9:20, to a question of Jesus concerning his essential identity, about which he pressed the disciples for an opinion, Peter answered for them all that Jesus is the Messiah, or God's Messiah. In adjuring them to be silent, Jesus rejected the response as perhaps too partial, too political. In the Matthean version, 16:13, expanding upon the narrative in Mark, Peter answered for himself and presumably for the other disciples, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." A new dimension of understanding was thus reached, and this heightened awareness of Jesus' divinity was approved by Jesus and occasioned Peter's ordination. In what may be a grouping of Petrine material, Matthew chapter 16 verses 18, 19, the confession, naming, and receiving of authority, Jesus gave to Simon the title of Cephas, or Peter. Though in the past some authorities considered that the title, meaning rock, refers to Jesus himself or to Peter's faith, the consensus of the great majority of scholars today is that the most obvious and traditional understanding should be construed, namely, that the title refers to the person of Peter. In John the title was granted at what may have been the first meeting between Jesus and Simon, 142. Thus, when the name was given is open to question, but that the name was given by Jesus to Simon seems fairly certain. Matthew goes on to state that upon this rock, that is, upon Peter, the church will be built. The word church in the first century gospel according to Matthew is to be understood as referring to the community of the faithful rather than to a definite ecclesiastical organization. The authenticity of the uniquely Matthean material, Matthew chapter 16 verses 16 to 19, of this narrative has been widely discussed and has been challenged on the basis that verses 16 to 19 are found only in Matthew or that the inclusion of the word church suggests a level of organization acquired only at a later period. Though these and other arguments against authenticity are given most careful consideration, the general consensus is that at some time, and more likely at the end of his career, these words were spoken by Jesus. If Peter's confession demonstrates his faith and insight, his denial that he knew Jesus demonstrates a weakness of will, even if momentary, capability of inaction, and a tendency toward vacillation, but not a loss of faith. Prior to the denial, out of his deep love for Jesus and his overestimation of his own capabilities, he had sought to overrule Jesus' prophecy of his denial and declared that, even if the other disciples deserted Jesus, he would suffer death rather than disown his Lord. Matthew chapter 26 verses 33 to 35. Mark chapter 14 verses 29 to 31. Luke chapter 22 verses 31 to 34. John chapter 13 verses 37 to 38. As the drama unfolded, Peter fled when Jesus was arrested but did find his way to the palace of the high priest where Jesus had been taken. When confronted in the courtyard with the danger of admitting association with Jesus, he chose to deny. Matthew chapter 26 verses 69 to 75. Mark chapter 14 verses 66 to 72. Luke chapter 22 verses 54 to 61. John chapter 18 verses 15 to 18, 25 to 27. The degree of his shame and the depth of his love were revealed when he later realized that the prophecy had been fulfilled, and he wept bitterly. Matthew chapter 26 verse 75. Mark chapter 14 verse 72. The fact of Peter's denial did not destroy the love and trust that Jesus felt for him. Among the apostles, it was to Peter, who had confessed the sonship of Jesus, Matthew chapter 16 verse 16, who had been commissioned earlier to lend strength to his brothers, Luke chapter 22 verse 32, who had hesitated in his resolution at one crucial point, Mark chapter 14 verses 66 to 72, and who on the morning of the resurrection ran to the tomb, Luke chapter 24 verse 12, that the resurrected Christ first appeared. The earliest report of Peter's priority as a witness to the risen Jesus is found in the letters of Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 5, and this most probably is the intent of Luke 24:34. An initial appearance to Peter in Galilee may have been included in the original ending of Mark 16, 6-8. The silence concerning this important matter of priority in Matthew and John is remarkable. It may be, however, that Matthew chapter 14 verses 27, 28 represents a misplaced post-resurrection narrative, and John the 21st may contain an echo of the tradition preserved by Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 5. Whether or not Jesus appeared first to Peter after the resurrection, he was a witness, which Peter declared to be a criterion of apostleship, Acts chapter 1 verse 22.